No mai haere mai. Welcome to Farmers in the Field, where our Earthworker alumni share their regenerative organic horticulture projects. Join us in co-learning through these biology-first conversations and growing radical hope through food. You can hear about our mentors in episode 1. Come join us.
Hi, my name's Rebecca. I'm from Kumeu Community Garden. So this is our team. This was back last year. We've got a committee of over 10 awesome people, and it took them over 2 years to actually get the permission to use this council land to make a community garden. And it's really awesome that the council have let us take this land. We've got about 300 square meters of a total of about 1,000-meter site. We do hope to expand, but we may not just yet. And so it's been about 2 years since we've been growing. And this was last year, in August, 2 days before the Kumeu floods. As you can see, it's pretty bare, and this is it afterwards. I'd say probably 8 months later. I was actually at the start of the project. I didn't start the project. It was actually Martin, a guy who I actually met on Earthworkers. We were both volunteering at Earthworkers together, and he said, "Hey, I'm moving to Raglan. Would you like to take over my community garden?" And I thought I just could not pass on this opportunity. And I didn't have much of a garden space where I was staying, and so I was happy to make the commute from Mount Eden to Kumeu. And I've been volunteering at OMG for I had been volunteering for about a year before I actually had the opportunity to take over the community garden. And so I was able to apply all of my knowledge that I learned from Levi and now Jake, which has really just been awesome. I've been able to completely leapfrog conventional agriculture and go straight into regenerative agriculture, which is amazing. And I've just had so much success. So this was just a year afterwards. As you could see from the first photos, it was all pretty bare, and we've been able to get a really good height. And yeah, so as the only gardener, I've just been able to have full reign. And so I've just applied all of the OMG and For the Love of Bees principles. And it's just really been quite amazing. We've got about 70 square meters of beds, and this is how it looks currently. Even though we've just had winter, everything's just so abundant and full. We actually have more food than mouths to feed. So if anyone is in Kumeu and wanting some cheap, organic, regenerative vegetables, then you know where to go. And we're also looking for some more volunteers if anyone also wants to give a hand. Our motto is give what you can, take what you need. And we work on a pretty giving principle. So we just want to give as much as we can back to the community. So anyone who volunteers is very welcome to help themselves to lots of veggies. We just want to share the word as much as possible, really. And yeah, so that's pretty much where we are now. Yeah, so I just want to thank OMG for giving me the knowledge to apply to Kumeu. And also a big thank you to the committee members and Martin for giving me the opportunity to have full reign and make the most of the land. It's really a wonderful opportunity and place to learn.
Hi, my name's Rebecca and I'm from Kumeu Community Gardens in Kumeu. And yeah, I did Earthworkers, and it was just really awesome experience. And I think what I learned the most from it is really putting together all of this background knowledge. So I kind of had watched a lot of videos and did a permaculture course, and it all fitted well with my innate understanding of how these systems work. But what I really loved from Earthworkers was really all of the science and all of the actual definitive knowledge that really helped me piece it all together. And then that enables me to be more confident when I'm explaining things and like sharing this knowledge with other people. And it really gives me that confidence and helps me back it up. This row here, which is row 8, although it doesn't look like it right now, actually here they are, my asparagus. So this I want to have as my asparagus bed, and I want to have the whole bed eventually asparagus, but also have other veg obviously on top of it, because asparagus, it doesn't actually take up so much room. And so I was going to have other veg that aren't root vegetables, because I know that they have quite a sensitive root system. And this other bed, row 9, I want to have a mainly strawberry bed. And obviously as well, it's also going to be, you know, polycropped with strawberries and other stuff. Like here we have a perennial allium. And then I've also got lots of other things growing. But then I'm like nitpicking with what else I'm going to put in. And then this bed over here, which I've kind of just started, will be a predominantly rhubarb bed. But I will also interplant it with lots of other things as well. I know it doesn't look very polycropped, but I do plan to polycrop it a bit more. But yeah, I have, they are quite diverse, although they're quite bare at the moment.
So you're talking before about this being potentially kind of due to not being there all the time. So that you're having these more focus on perennial crops being the basis of the bed, and then perhaps shorter term crops basically growing in between that, when maybe those crops aren't in their fruiting stages or whatever they happen to be. I mean, it's a little challenging in some respects, and it's going to take some trial and error. There's no question about, particularly with things like asparagus. I mean, that's what everybody wants to do essentially, is have an asparagus bed that they then crop the rest of the year for other things. And I mean, asparagus beds do take quite a number of years to really form, and same with rhubarb. I mean, technically you shouldn't really be harvesting off them for at least the first year, which is really hard for people to sort of get their head around, but they need to form that root system to support productive upper crop. And even with asparagus, it can take a good couple of years to really get into a point where you actually want to be harvesting them. So, that's a long-term project. I think that I can see why you're wanting to do it. I will say that the experience that, like when you talk with Levi around the guild, some of the guild planting, the polycropping that gets done actually is quite long-term, and when you plant it out, in some cases, 4, 5, 6 months later, they're still actually, it's only coming to the end. So it's not like a 30-day or 60-day or even 90-day polycrop. They're usually much more. So there's even following that principle is much longer term. The difficulty, I guess, is when it comes to harvesting. And some of the crops, like if you were to plant, say, tomatoes, for argument's sake, I mean, if you're not basically there every sort of 3-4 days harvesting them, or courgettes or something, because they go from being not pickable to being massive in the space of like 3 days. So there's some of those limitations, probably more around the harvesting than there is, because even strawberries, when that's in production, somebody has to be there basically to pick them every day. because strawberries go off very, very quickly in terms of when they're ready and ripe and able to be picked. So that might actually be a bigger limitation than the actual planting and what you're growing. I mean, even asparagus in the day when asparagus comes up, those guys are out in those fields every single day harvesting the spears that come up at the prime state to get a really good, because if it goes too long and too old, it becomes a very odd, stringy, unpalatable thing. So there's another aspect that you probably got to think of. You know, and maybe the answer is not necessarily going more perennial, because although it cuts down how often you're planting stuff, it actually might exacerbate the other end of it, which is when they come to harvest, they can be quite demanding. And there are other crops, you know, like even say lettuce. When you plant it, you might plant it a lot, but a lettuce, I've had things you can sit there, or celery, you know, that they can be picked once a week, and it's not a problem. You know, it's not, you don't have to go every day to pick it. So yeah, that's kind of different aspects of looking at. So I'd have a good conversation with Levi over that, and different guild options maybe that you might want to look at necessarily then. Jumping too heavily down the perennial route, because I can see the other end of that cycle is quite demanding, and those not rhubarb so much, but certainly strawberries and asparagus. They're often things that traditionally are picked daily.
Yeah, I guess just to summarize and just put in another language what Daniel said, in general, with those gardens that you're only visiting, you know, 1 to 2 days a week, the selection of crops is very important. And just to kind of narrow it down, asparagus is a bit of an anomaly, but the leaves, anything that's a crop that's a leaf, is in general going to have a much longer window of harvest, which is good. So leaves and roots generally have a decent window of harvest. But fruits, on the other hand, unless they're attached to a tree or a perennial tree, if you're talking about annual fruits, aubergines, strawberries, capsicums, not so much. But yeah, I guess there's more of a finer harvest window with those specific things. Yeah. And just to emphasize what Daniel's saying as well, you don't necessarily need to just swap the whole thing out to you know, you're not there that often, so you don't necessarily have to do you know, like short-term annual crops. Like, I get that, like, you don't want to be doing lots of short-term fast production crops because you're not there all the time, but you can still plant annual guilds, you know, with vegetable species that are going to continue to produce and grow for a very long time, if planted at the right time and in the right moment, can be quite successful. Chilies and capsicums come to mind, so do leeks, celery, celeriac, rhubarb, any like silver beet, chard, all the herbs and the parsleys are phenomenal. Perennial herbs, definitely. But yeah, I'd be having a close look, especially if the strawberry patch. I can just foresee Rebecca, you sort of turning up to hundreds of strawberries that have been eaten by birds, and they require a decent amount of you know, sort of cost and resources to implement a decent strawberry patch. But yeah, I guess it sort of depends if it's just solely you that's managing it. But yeah, always very important before you plant a crop to think, how am I going to harvest this? Am I going to be able to harvest this, and am I going to be able to distribute this to the people that are going to eat it? Those are the two most important things, because you don't want to plant more than what you're able to distribute, and you also don't want to plant more than you're able to physically harvest. Yeah.
So I think that Levi and Daniel have covered the crops really well. I would exactly support what Levi said, and I find the chards, myriads of different chards that you can get in, and spinach can be a little trickier, but silver beets and chards and leeks. I find leeks, and in the scenario that I'm a very, very lazy gardener, because I'm quite busy doing other things, and I find that those things just go and go and go and go. And again, in your lazy scenario, I'd let a couple of your leeks go to flower and just allow them to drop and create seedlings for you. So, but the other thing I would also say is that you don't have great access to water on that site, so it's not only those other concerns, but it's also to do with water. So I would be thinking about your polycropping being, what are the things that are going to give me a great living mulch, and that's also going to be a really worthwhile thing for you. You want to have as much cover as you possibly can. You want to have plants that are really sponsoring great fungal networks, because they store water, and things that you can easily, like if you're there once a week, can do a bit of chop and drop and actually just kind of keep in the summer, keep as much water in the system as you possibly can by, things transpiring and the rest of it, and things breaking down.
Sarah, you've got a crop of asparaguses.
Yeah, I do.
You've got a long-term asparagus bed, and I'm interested to know what your strategy is, because they come on in the springtime and then you let them grow right up. But in terms of what do you plant with them to keep that green photosynthesis, have you a strategy with that?
The asparagus bed was probably the bed where I first started to really understand the benefits of no tilling.
Yeah.
That you never till an asparagus bed. We get, like, I'm up to my sixth major harvest already of asparagus this season. And I often would put a tomato plant in. Again, I read off the internet a million years ago that, a tomato plant was really good as a companion plant to asparagus. I put one or two plants in, and I literally would not have to go back to that garden bed, barely have to water it. Always the biggest, craziest tomato plant on the whole of the block, and it would produce like a prolific amount of tomatoes. And that wasn't to do with the asparagus, it was to do with the fact that I had tilled those soils, and I had done a really good job just giving those asparagus a little light dosing of actually potash and compost every year. So but again, with asparagus, you do have to harvest them like when they're ready. And so you're asking me about leaf cover. We go away at Christmas time. It doesn't matter who I get to house it. They never crop the asparagus. And so I come back to basically ferns, and, I let those ferns stay in there. One of my favorite plants that, parsley goes crazy around my asparagus bed, but I've got way too much parsley. I use parsley as a cover crop. Anywhere that I haven't got the energy to, look after something, I let a parsley seedling take over in that area. But it's chervil. Chervil is my favorite herb that I happen to grow in my asparagus bed. It is so delicious. It almost is never available. It is one of the most gorgeous, easy to grow plants. It doesn't grow too big. And I love chervil. The other thing I would say is the globe artichokes in your scenario. This is not in your asparagus beds, but your globe artichokes are a fantastic perennial, and you do want to harvest those when they're quite young. But if you don't catch them at that point, you can still sell them or you can still use them if they're slightly bigger. But the asparagus bed is, over winter, essentially, I have asparagus that has gone to, become a fern, and I have chervil, and I have parsley, those leafy greens. I've stopped doing the tomatoes there simply because, they do become simply enormous. The soil system is so great there. I tend to put them in other parts of the garden. But The great thing about your no-dig gardens is if you do actually keep building the soil network, you will get tomatoes to grow there really well without having to water them so much, because you're just building those really good resilient, drought resistant, in a sense, soil systems. Did that answer your question, Levi?
Yeah. I guess I was just interested in if there is a possibility to do because I imagine they go into a fern and then at some point in late summer or autumn you chop them down.
That's right.
Mulch them. And then is there possibility then to plant some broccoli, get a harvest from there, and then chop that down before your asparagus comes up again? Or is it just not an intensive management? Do you need to be more patient?
Look, I think she's right in terms of that. They do have a fragile soil system, so I try and do the things that self-seed, like your parsleys, like your chervil, things that you can be as less invasive as possible. I think is a really good idea.
Yeah.
I'm also thinking, Levi, things like thyme. I use oreganum, and my garden has become my go-to cover. It is really delicious, seriously underutilized as a herb, and just brilliant. A little bit, stir fried. It's fantastic in herbs, but it is so resilient in drought, and it will give you that beautiful cover. And the other thing is you let it go to seed, and it will produce literally hundreds of seedlings for you the following year to start planting out. And I really manage my calendula and my oreganum as the cover that I put into spaces when I need something to be filled and I need it to be low because I don't want it to be competing with my with my beetroots or any of those sorts of things. And it's a great comeback cut again herb.
How's your watering situation? I know we were talking earlier about that. So is that likely to be improving in this summer, or are you still stuck with the same sort of limitations you were last summer?
I think we'll be more or less stuck. I mean, we have we had a water pump donated, but then we still need to sort it out and then see if any hose pipes are suitable, but that would still I'm not really sure how we could get that done, to be honest.
Yeah.
But I'm sure someone with a better mind in that area will be able to sort it out. But I mean, we haven't done any watering for a long time now.
Well, obviously over this winter, no, you probably would have been more worried about being flooded there than necessarily needing to irrigate. But because one of the questions you obviously had the issue with potatoes not growing. And I suspect in that particular situation, you said when you planted them, is that quite often if they don't get regular and adequate water, they will really struggle to do much.
Right.
They're very, very dependent on that. Root crops often are, interestingly enough. Carrots are another one, very finicky. If you overwater it, you get splitting. If you underwater it, the combination of variation in watering will get them to split. There's lots of different things that happen around those root crops if the watering. So it's potentially maybe a crop that you want to possibly steer away from because of that watering limitation, which is where I was looking at, what would a reason that potatoes, would produce not a lot, and you don't get a lot of top growth and that sort of stuff. And generally that's pretty much down to, they should grow like crazy. But when in Auckland, where you are, about end of September to middle of October, suddenly the water conditions, the soil moisture runs very quickly into deficit. And if you're not able to give it regular watering from about mid-October at the latest, that's something in an early season that can happen quicker. But the soil deficit, the plants start to sort of, really the soil starts to dry out quite quickly. And if you're not, and with potatoes, if you're not giving them adequate water, they just won't do much. They'll just sit there and look at you. The leaf growth won't be great. I mean, there's difference if you get lots of vegetative growth and it's not growing much potatoes. that's a different story. But from what you said to me, you just weren't getting a lot of growth and then not a lot of potatoes. So that says water. If you get lots of vegetative growth and not a lot of tubers, or the tuber is very small, that's a real lack of potassium and an excess of nitrogen. So you're getting lots of vegetative, but nothing really happening in the root zone. So yeah, I suspect that your lack of watering over the summer was a stress for them, and they're pretty much not able to do much of anything. I mean, that's what I would look at. So again, looking at your crops, if the watering is going to be a limitation, perennials are going to be useful, but even then, things like strawberries and stuff, they really will struggle. And planting them early enough is going to be critical to get them established, and the soil conditions, and particularly having enough cover so having enough plants actually covering the soil, so that any soil that's exposed is just going to bake dry. You want to have as much cover on that soil as possible when it comes to irrigation and watering requirements, that sort of stuff. So
yeah, although it seems like it's soil, this is actually grass that I put over it that's turned to soil pretty quickly, actually. But I put a really thick layer of wet grass clippings on here.
On top of it, and it was bark underneath that?
This bit I had actually replaced, because we have some used potting mix over there in that giant pile, and so I was slowly replacing the beds. The wood chip based beds, I just completely remove the wood chip and then replace it with that soil.
Okay. Just quickly on that, because it's actually, you stumble on something that's quite important. Used potting mix isn't actually all that useful, because used potting mix, one, will generally come with a lot of weed seeds. Two is that depending on the potting mix, usually if they're like a peat pumice or is it a bark-based potting mix? I'm not sure, but between those two, potting mix runs out of. It's very difficult as it gets old to keep it wet. So what I would do is, where you've got bark laid down and when there's wood chips there, what you've actually done by putting grass clippings, mulch grass clippings on top of it, is actually the ideal way to turn bark mulch into soil, right? Because you've got lots of carbon to nitrogen. Basically, you've got lots of carbon and little nitrogen in the bark chips. Well, as soon as you come with fresh grass clippings, it's basically a massive nitrogen with a little bit of carbon. And if you lay it in there, it's kind of the ideal thing to basically turn that into soil. So when we've got beds that are really heavily and had lots of bark, and Sarah will be able to confirm that experience, it's one of the fastest remedial things is actually to use fresh grass clippings in there, full of bacteria, full of energy. Put it in there, and it will, like you can see, sometimes you literally turn the thing into soil. So I wouldn't be too quick to play with a potting mix too much. I think you could put, if you can get sources of grass clippings, you can put that together with bark and make some reasonable compost out of that process as well. But it's certainly one of your questions there was, what's the fastest way to break it down? Well, you've stumbled on it. You have got it. It is grass. That is literally the quickest way. Green, fresh grass clippings. The fresher they are to a certain degree, the better, because it's that initial cut, and when you initially put it in a pile, it generates all that heat and energy, and that's what you're trying to capture.
Great.
Yeah.
I did stop doing the replacement of the beds, because I found that as I got to the older beds, there was just so much such a big fungal network, and I didn't really want to disturb it. So I thought, maybe I'll just put loads of grass clippings on. So I'm glad that was a good choice.
It just wakes it up. It basically, the fungi will go nuts on the wood chip, but that tends to slow everything down in terms of what you're trying to grow. They want a much more balanced bacterial to fungal ratio, and putting grass clippings. The best thing is to get grass clippings that hasn't come off grass that's gone to seed. So you want kind of, the lawn clippings that you get. So when you cut a lawn and it's not full of flowers and really long, but it's just a grass clipping that's not all full of seed, and that's quite ideal. But yeah, you kind of want it straight, put it into a bag, because if you leave it in a pile, of course, it just turns to mush. You know, it goes smelling horrible. You have to kind of want to spread it before it gets to that messy stage. But no, that sounds like that's going to wake up some of those beds quite a lot.
And I'm kind of curious around the water retention conversation. If you've got high fungi in some of those places, does that help get you through the drought or even out the drought, or is there plants that you can plant that will help with that?
Yeah, I mean, any leaf that covers the soil, that stops the sun hitting the soil directly, will reduce evaporation. So then the plant will then govern, because the sun is hitting the leaf, and the plant's able to cool it. So the soil is remaining cooler. So you're improving, the soil health through that process. So having any green leaf over the soil is preferable. In terms of soil and water retention, in terms of, say, fungal dominance, it's interesting. Bacteria are incredibly useful in water storage as well. They actually produce an exudate in some of these bacteria that actually like water crystals, and they actually are very good at holding on to moisture. Fungi just basically loving the high carbon component, which unfortunately tends to be often in those situations without adding the grass and getting the bacteria and actually turning into soil. You actually often end up with all that bark going down without doing something to correct it. Is you end up with a hydrophobic system, which actually repels water. So if you have a big pile of bark and you try and water it without actually soaking it, it just runs off it, runs through it, disappears, and it's dry 5 minutes later. To get bark to soak it, you've literally got to soak it for weeks, kind of thing, to get it to soak up water. So it's kind of a natural repellent. By bringing that grass in and turning the bark into soil and getting all that bacterial activity, is you're improving all the time that water holding capacity. Organic matter is really good. For every 1% of organic matter, I think from memory, it holds 175,000 litres of water per hectare for every 1% of organic matter. So you imagine you've got 10% of organic matter, which is the ideal. You've got the capacity to store an extra 1.7 million litres of water per hectare. So that's the key water storage component. But if you've got a whole lot of heaps of carbon, but it's in this kind of sort of half decomposted bark form, yes, there's lots of carbon, but it's not actually going to hold any water. It's not organic matter at that point. It's still basically raw carbon. So you have to turn it into soil, which is what you're doing. But yeah, just be wary of the potting mix. Putting too much potting mix in often is not a great move. You'll have the reverse effect. You won't improve the soil a great deal, if any, at all, with that particular type of product.
Yeah, I was really only using it to replace the beds, and I haven't used any for about a year.
Yeah. I'm just saying, it's not that it doesn't have a use. It's just be careful of it. It's not it's no panacea for a bed that's asleep and not functioning. But chucking grass clippings on top of these things, if they're full of old bark, that's sort of sitting there when you dig through it, and there's this big chunks of sort of uncomposted bark or partially composted bark, then the fastest way to wake it up is actually with grass. So
just to say, reiterate what Daniel says is that, make sure that you have those cover. And I think I talked about that in answering your other question. And I have had a similar experience where I put a lot of bark on, thinking that was going to be a great way to kickfire my fungal networks, but it's been great for my fruit trees, but was really everything was just super, super slow around those garden beds for years. And the carbon being way too high, the carbon ratio being way too high. So with the grass clippings, what you do is that you're actually breeding bacteria. And in order for the bacteria to breed, they need to consume 2 parts carbon to every 1 part nitrogen. So it's a great way of actually kind of cleaning out that extra carbon as well. And they're breeding bacteria, which is then feeding protozoa, which is then feeding your worms. So I would be looking, Rebecca, at looking at the grass that's around that area and looking at like, here's a serious resource, allowing it to grow, like really talking to who's ever mowing that area and allowing it to grow as high as you can so that you can actually get really good piles of it. That's going to be your best mulch to get you over the summer, and again to turn those high carbon beds into soil, as you said. Now, for those of you who don't have high carbon soils, becomes a point where you don't want to be using grass clippings, because, as I said, it uses 2 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. That's what the bacteria use in order to breed, and that's what they're doing, and that's why it's hot. That's evidence of those microbes breeding, because actually that will strip potentially carbon out of other types of garden beds quickly. It can still be a great mulch resource, but what you want to do when you get to that point, and this is something also I have learned, where I'm putting way too much nitrogen into the system, and like any input, too much in the wrong place isn't great, and you get fast growth but weak growth, and you're actually burning your carbon out of your soils that you don't want to be burning. So what I do in those instances is that I just let my piles go brown, and then I use those piles once they're not so high in nitrogen that's bled out of them. It's been utilized already, and you've just got a kind of a soft sort of carbon source that you can, for example, put into a bucket of water with your microbes, and then put that on in the heat of summer to kind of cover your soils and get that water in.
Yeah, cool. And I've got 2 comments just around the summer watering and this question of water retention in soils. And obviously the thing that we teach is the best kind of mulch is a living mulch. So the number one strategy really is to make sure that in the springtime you're planting with the knowledge that the crops that you're planting are actually going to see out the drought and see out the summer season, because a mature crop that's taller once the drought hits has deeper roots. It has access to more water. It has more leaves. It has the ability to defend itself better in these harsher climates. So that's the first thing I'd say, is really just make sure that you're filling it up as dense as possible with crops that are going to last the length of time. Obviously, that is a goal that sometimes isn't achieved. Something might happen, and then, as we see on your beds here, there's like patches of bare soil, and that's the thing that is just a couple of days hot sun on a bare soil patch, and you can just lose so much water. It's not even funny. And in your case, not having access to watering and that's quite difficult. The other thing that I'll say is that when you are mulching, mulch is also a very effective method of keeping soils wet, but what a lot of people do when they mulch in the summer is they just don't put it on thick enough. It has to be quite a thick layer. If you do that much mulch, it's not going to cut it at all. That much mulch is just going to shrink down, and then you're going to have a centimeter on top, and it's not going to work. So with the grass, we like to, when you've got your either your green grass clippings or it's a dry higher carbon grass, just mixing that in a slurry with some compost, and then sort of slapping it down real thick, and then it sort of it'll form a mat, and it'll actually really protect the soil. We want to be mulching, if you're going to be mulching, mulch thick, because a thin pile of mulch just it just gets swept away.
And just to add one more thing in terms of, I think we're growing in Auckland, we're not growing in Dunedin, and I'm finding that crops that are naturally in the ground anyway are maturing much earlier. So again, getting those crops in the ground a couple of months earlier than you otherwise might have, to be able to kind of get the kind of bulk of their growing done before that kind of water pressure comes on.
Cool. Thank you, guys. Bye.
If you are inspired to become an earthworker and learn more about regenerative organic horticulture, look up our Earthworkers Programme on our website to register for our upcoming courses. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support us in making more, we welcome donations on our website fortheloveofbees.co.nz. For the Love of Bees is a charitable trust creating a system of self-sustaining urban farms in Aotearoa that cultivate quality food for local people through regenerative organic horticultural practices that heal the ecosystem. Through these sites, we create happier and healthier ecosystems and resilient, connected communities. We also create and share high-quality, accessible educational experiences around what a truly regenerative world looks like. For the Love of Bees aims to become a world-leading example of partnership, regeneration and participation for a thriving collective future. We started in 2016 as an optimistic and love-centred approach to engaging with ecosystem well-being in a time of climate uncertainty.